Hey guys, how are you all doing today? Today, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit more about the mission of Reading World magazine, which is to enhance the utility, the understanding, and the collaboration of the global community, and really to enhance those different metrics at a time in the future when none of the people that are alive today are still around. So, this is really separating the idea of the future from the competition that we have today between different groups, different nations, different cities, different peoples. Because when we think about purely about the future, we're thinking a lot less of what the benefits and costs are for us today. So really to think about this mission in the context of some kind of policy, it would be if there was a policy that could be passed today that was a global policy that would, after everyone that's alive now is gone, lift the standard of living by 20%, lift the aggregate health by 20%, increase the lifespan by 20%, give everybody 20% less stress, 20% less economic stress, and 20% more happiness. And this idea really is if we could leave behind a better world, if we could elevate the human species in the future after we were gone, and if we could write one policy fix that would have that effect in some 130 years or 150 years, what would that policy be? So this idea of bettering the future, of enhancing the human species, really leaving behind a more equitable, a better managed, a more calmed down, matured human species is really this idea of the mission behind Reading World magazine. And so it opens up a big can of worms and a lot of vectors, surfaces for attack, because as soon as you start to introduce an idea like that, you begin to say, well, one, we know what constitutes a better future, or we have some idea of what constitutes a better future, and that's for everybody else that we would impose that future. Two, it says really that a more contained competition is really better for the human species. And it ultimately says that the human species is better for the universe and the human species is better for the planet, and that if we advance all of these metrics, it's better sort of for everyone, for all of the existence in the universe. So it's an abstract idea, and it is a challenge, to unhinge that idea from the universe itself. You're saying, of course it's about humanity. It's not something that goes beyond that. But the idea itself really is also a catch-all for almost every movement out there in the human species. And there are a lot of movements in the human species, movements for climate change, movements for animal welfare, movements for better health, movements for equality, international law, and the list of, I almost forgot one of my favorite movements, which is the movement for water and access to water. And of course, there's energy policy movements as well. So all of these movements together sort of fall under this catch-all umbrella, this idea of what I've called the equilibrium. And the equilibrium, when you start talking about the equilibrium, it does sound a little bit like a science fiction novel. You're saying this equilibrium, that we could somehow find this equilibrium. It's a bit of a mysterious, strange word to use. But if you think back through history, this concept has been introduced again and again under different types of names. The one that comes to mind easiest for me is this idea of the utopia. And we hear this come up again in movies. There are books written about it. It's this idea of happiness, of a balanced existence for the human species. And one of the questions really is, does such a state even exist? And if it does, are we moving toward that state? Are we moving toward an equilibrium? So we have, what is an equilibrium? Are we moving toward an equilibrium? And what does an equilibrium look like? What does a utopia look like? And that's really where these metrics are born from, these ideas of 20% more happiness, 20% better healthcare, 20% greater aggregate health, 20% more understanding of different species, of different nations, of our universe, of our planet. All of these measures, these metrics, are really some way of defining what this equilibrium actually is. And of course, communism was a movement toward some kind of equilibrium. It was based on the premise that if everything was economically distributed equally, then everybody would be equally happier and everybody would be equally better off. So again, it was this idea of some sort of an equilibrium, but it was an enforced equilibrium that didn't really take into account this idea of human nature, this idea of inspiration, of motivation, and of course, the selfish gene as well, perhaps, this idea of competition. And so when I think of the idea of competition, which seems to sit in contradiction to this idea of an equilibrium, and I tend to believe, of course, like everybody, that it doesn't. It's not in competition. If we go to this idea of the invisible hand is sort of saying pure competition benefits everybody. Because if you have pure competition, ultimately you're going to have skyscrapers. Ultimately, you're going to have advancements in technology. You're going to create more productivity. So the invisible hand says a lot of these things, but it doesn't actually answer the question of why we want these things. And I think it's in that intention that a lot of the results, the effects, the side effects of progress or of productivity or of modern productive economies is born, because the metric of sort of the selfish gene, or the metric of the invisible hand, ultimately it comes up with these ideas of obviously targeting, for example, earnings per share or profit per share at any expense. And so the idea really is a huge question, and answering that question is possibly for future generations, possibly beyond our ability as a human species. But we have a lot of answers and we have a lot of ideas about this, and we are making a lot of progress. And if we look back statistically through the history, we can see a lot of advancements in these areas, a lot of advancements towards a higher average standard of living, which would be defined as a larger middle class and a smaller people in the poverty group, and a fewer amount of people at the extreme, in the areas of extreme wealth. And so, of course, balancing things out is one idea, one way that we can think of actualizing on this concept of an equilibrium. And where competition fits into this is, of course, I do have one analogy that I use for competition, which is somewhat speculation, but it really comes from the idea of looking at how animals behave in nature. Specifically, you can think of antelopes or goats or rhinoceroses, animals that have horns, and animals that compete in mating season with their horns. They rut, they buck up against one another with their horns, with their antlers, they tangle with one another, and basically they're determining who's who. Because the idea about who's who is what's going to help solve the mating question. With whom shall the females mate, and how should the species procreate? What's sort of best for the species? This concept, again, of the selfish gene. So when we see, which is a book by Richard Dawkins. So when we see this idea of the horns, we can make note of the fact that the horns are not deadly. In most cases, animals that compete in the mating season with horns, they don't kill one another. They don't die. They compete, but then, and there's a winner, and the loser slinks off and sulks about it. That year, they did not win the trophy, and they go back and they attempt to become stronger to come back and compete in the next cup for the next victory. So this idea, it persists throughout nature. And so the question really is, of course, it's competition, but it's a balanced type of competition. And so the question is, are we there as a species? Are we in a state of balanced competition? Do we kill one another? Do we cause too much damage or not enough? These are very valid questions in the context of what is competition, because you can imagine a future where instead of actually murdering segments of society, we have competitions and sports games. And you might say, well, that's nonsensical, or what a beatnik, or have any other type of perspective or opinion about that concept, but it is a valid concept when you look at centuries that go by and you look at it in the context of these ideas of things like utopia, or things like this grand equilibrium, the equilibrium. It sounds like something from a science fiction novel, and or it's abstract, and fanciful. And so a part of what I wanted to do is to give it some merit in terms of redefining it along actionable metrics and clarifying what those metrics are and sort of the intent of those metrics, the idea of those metrics. When we think of this notion of an equilibrium, what we're really thinking of is a notion of more equity, a more equitable existence as a human species. And ultimately, we are aiming for some idea of a higher level of satisfaction on aggregate for everyone. In economics, this is called utility, and it's a common function that's taught in economics classes. There's a utility function, and it's defined as the aggregate level of happiness or aggregate level of utility, which is really measured in this. It goes back to an economist named Jevons, if I recall exactly, not Marshall. It was definitely Jevons. And he had this diamond water paradox. So it's really the idea if you're in a desert and you are very thirsty and somebody offers you a bag full of diamonds or a glass of water, you're obviously going to take the glass of water because if you take the diamonds, you're going to die. So if you have many diamonds but you do not have a lot of water, then water is worth a lot more to you than diamonds. So it's really this idea of utility is this abstract idea of what has value to you, what has meaning to you. And what we find generally is that happiness has meaning to people. This is why we have an entertainment industry, why we have music, why we have fashion. One of the reasons, there are a lot of reasons, happiness is an important metric for the standard of living and for our existence as a species. It's very meaningful for individuals to be content, to be satisfied, to be happy. So if we can increase the happiness around the globe by 20% on average, then that is really the target. And of course, a lot of people are already doing a lot toward this. Almost every movement that's out there is working toward this. There are many people who live the lives of doctors. They live the lives of maybe evangelists in some sense. They are maybe Doctors Without Borders. You can think of different groups of people, organizations who have made for some reason they're pursuing a mission which is really about ultimately achieving some aspects of this goal. Of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has all kinds of metrics and does a lot of on-the-ground work on this philanthropy, which actually moves toward these targets in very demonstrable ways, very palatable directions. And so that's what you can do when you have capital to deploy. You have excess capital, you have philanthropic money that can be deployed towards really achieving ultimately this objective. So the mission of Reading World Magazine, how Reading World Magazine aims to achieve this objective is through sorting information. It's based on the Song by the Police, introduced, I believe it was 1992? It was the Police. It was Too Much Information. And that song triggered this idea about sorting information to come up with sort of the cream of the crop of information, of data. So it is based on this idea that modern technologies are favoring expression. And everywhere from social media to AI enhances how we as individuals can express ourselves. So we can express ourselves on videos, on YouTube now. We can become influencers. We can write books. We have all of these different ways of expressing ourselves. And of course, this idea of the cream of the crop of information is a subjective idea. And it's within that subjective idea that we come to an idea of the implicit, inherent monopoly power, to use a term from economics, within this notion of what I've coined aggregation journalism. So that's kind of the Reading World Magazine way of aggregating information is called aggregation journalism, and it's expressed through our own media collections. And media collections are a mixture between an art form and an aggregation of information. And so our collections, of course, are unique. And I believe that media collections are already exploding. If you sign up for a newsletter anywhere, you are signing up for a media collection. You are signing up for aggregation journalism. Because when we begin to put information together in different types of designs, it creates a unique fingerprint, and that unique fingerprint has a unique impact. It is when you consume that information, you're consuming it in a unique way. And if you go to a library today and you look at the number of books that exist in the library, you're going to find hundreds of thousands of books, and each one of these is its own expression. And I believe in the future, you're going to find hundreds of thousands of media collections, different ways of aggregating information. And ultimately, these media collections are going to have different types of effects. Some of them are going to be life-changing. Some of them are going to help people to figure out how to establish a career, how to be economically successful. Some of them are going to help people about how to raise their children. Some of them are going to be helpful in terms of helping people pass the time or increase their intellectual acumen by a number of points or get better at a specific game. So all of these different types of targets, different types of effects that we can do when we begin to aggregate information, when we begin to aggregate media, are ultimately leading towards this question of making life better for people. That's ultimately the goal. And when we figure out a way to make life better for people, we create some kind of a transaction, and that's really how we exist as a species. And a lot of this goes back to this idea, again, from a fellow, you've probably heard of Steven Pinker. He wrote a book called Enlightenment Now. And, at the beginning of Enlightenment Now, he talks about this idea of defeating entropy, which is what humans sort of do. We're traveling through the universe toward chaos, which everything disappears, and we're defeating entropy. We defeat entropy. We gather matter and we rearrange it. From the way that nature has presented it to us, we're ultimately organizing matter into some shape or some form. We create some clothing, we create some tools, we create some designs. And this is ultimately what we do. And we do this so that we persist, we continue, and we have happiness ultimately. So once again, because I'm running out of storage on this camera, I wanted to once again just sort of reiterate this foundational principle of Reading World Magazine, which is a media aggregator, a news aggregator, and ultimately its goal is to enhance the utility, to the global understanding, and of course the global collaboration of the human knowledge community, of the human community, and ultimately it's to do this for this effect that is 130 years out from now. It's for this effect that is into the future, and the future is defined by a time when nobody that's alive today is still around. So thanks so much for watching, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys in the next video.